Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to announce the arrival of our guest of honor, Dr. Mohamad Maliki bin Osman, Senior Minister of State for Foreign Affairs and Defence, Singapore. Good morning, Dr. Mohamad Maliki bin Osman, Senior Minister of State for Foreign Affairs and Defence, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Shyam and I have the pleasure of being your MC for today. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, I welcome you to this morning's book launch and panel discussion. To kick off the proceedings, it is my honor to invite Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, and Ambassador at Large, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Singapore, to deliver the opening remarks. Ambassador Pillai, please.
Mr. Dr. Maliki, our special guest today, High Commissioner of India, High Commissioner of Pakistan, High Commissioner of Bangladesh. Welcome to this book launch and panel discussion that we are going to have. And all of you who have taken the trouble to come on this Tuesday morning. It's not always easy to do a program early in the morning, but I think the speakers, the subjects, I think have also appealed. First, I want to thank Dr. Maliki for sparing the time to be here. He really had to bend backwards to accommodate us. The Committee of Supplies is in session, and he is involved with this. But he has taken a little time off to come and be with us, and we are most appreciative. Normally, the task of the person who makes the opening remarks, as we put it in the time, is to welcome everybody, say some platitudes, and then not be heard after that, only to be seen. But because of the fact that what we are discussing is somewhat too close to my heart, I would like to stretch my remit a little bit and go outside to make one or two comments. There are two areas that I want to talk about. First, the author of this book. It's a wonderful, Mr. Saran is a very special person. If anybody reads these sort of complimentary messages from various people for his book, two words always come up: brilliant and true. And I think that aptly describes him. He was involved in the Indian Prime Minister's, the Prime Minister's special appointment on the nuclear deal. He was also involved in the climate change and many other things, but I'm just mentioning two. I've sometimes spent time talking to him about local politics, and it is like my old days back in college, where you sit through a tutorial. His professorial demeanor plus his deep knowledge makes you feel you're a student and he's a teacher. And I'm sure this book, when you get it and you read it, you'll find it's a fantastic book and very deep in its analysis, and his wide knowledge of many things. It comes up very strongly. I'm thankful to him for choosing Singapore, for choosing ISAS to launch his book here. It was already launched in India, and now it has been launched here. The second area that I wanted to talk about is the Indian foreign policy. I may get the attention of the Indian High Commissioner, but I hope he doesn't mind my going back a little bit in history. First, let me say, there has been a significant positive move in the foreign policy. India is now very keen to develop itself, its relationship with Southeast Asia, with the Middle East and so on. I'll come to that. But being an old man, I always go back to history, what is in the past. For us, the future is not very good, so we stick to the past. 1955, Bandung Conference. The treatment or the significance of Southeast Asia, well, I should say, it was totally insignificant, Southeast Asia's participation. The big guys were Egypt and India and China and so on. But what was a little troubling was that the spokesman for the Indian side, Mr. Krishna Menon, was totally dismissive of Southeast Asia. How do I know this? It's not been recorded anywhere. It's because the People's Action Party, the ruling party in Singapore, at that time they were still not fully independent, sent 2 observers to this conference. One of them happened to be one of my seniors in college and subsequently a good friend. He's no longer alive. And he told me, in the scheme of things, as far as India is concerned, Southeast Asia features very little. 20 years later, 1975 May, Vietnam invaded Cambodia. There's a world outcry. There's world outcry. Everybody protested. I think, I'm not sure what India said, but it was something rather muted. But what happened after that, within a very short period, my memory may not be totally correct, but India upgraded its diplomatic representation with Vietnam from charge to a full ambassador. This was taken almost like a slap in the face of ASEAN. And I asked then Indian High Commissioner in Singapore, and his response was, why not? Who should we be afraid of? I thought that response was not appropriate. But a few years later, or about a year later, a new book came out on the Cambodian district, a book by William Shawcross. The title was Nixon, East India and the Cambodian War. If you read that, it doesn't talk about India, but it explains why India was not willing to condemn Vietnam. Because the machinations of Kissinger, which was followed wholesale by the Vice President, created the situation in Cambodia where the Vietnamese had no choice but to go in. Cambodia was a neutral territory with Sihanouk, benign ruler, but then suddenly it was drawn into the war. He abdicated, he went to live in exile in Beijing, and Lon Nol, the general, became the ruler, and subsequently others, and the Khmer Rouge, you know the story. It was a very unhappy situation, and Vietnam decided to move in. Singapore played a role in this, in that we cannot, as a small country, condone anybody walking into your territory. And therefore, we were compelled. First, we wanted to. Second, we were compelled to register the biggest protest. And the Cambodian seat in the United Nations was kept vacant. And this was because of ASEAN I must say with some pride, mainly Singapore's efforts. That seat was kept vacant until things normalized in Cambodia and so on. So India had a reason not to condemn Vietnam. So now I understand. At that time I felt that it was something nonsense. But today, India has changed. Maybe we have changed. And India has moved in two areas. As far as Southeast Asia is concerned, the Act Asia is something that an active way of engaging Southeast Asia. So it is now you see that Mr. Modi taking a very positive position in various activities of ASEAN. And Singapore as the chairman this year, we're extremely happy. A more dramatic development, in my mind, is what's taking place in the Middle East. When you have a situation where the president of Iran says that India should be given veto rights in the United Nations, when you have Saudi Arabia opening its airspace to allow Air India to fly to Israel, when you have a situation where Oman builds an oil storage tank in India for safekeeping, you feel that the situation, and a few years back when you go, if there was a skirmish in somewhere in the border between India and Pakistan, the Arab world in one voice always condemned India. India takes its own sweet time to sort of react, but the feeling is that they feel outraged that, and India did not, shall I say, it took India 70 years to invite the Prime Minister of Israel to visit. But now it is such a warm relationship without any protests of any significance from the Arab world. This is the change. And the statement made by the leader of the Palestinians to say that Mr. Modi is probably the one person who can bring about some progress in the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. Even when India voted against, rightly so, voted against the Jerusalem being made the capital, Israelis did not violently react, because India has risen. My only hope is that India, the reigning major powers, have a certain arrogance about them and a certain tendency to discard the smaller countries. What are you? You are nothing. So we hope rising India, when it takes its position as a global player, will take into cognizance the voice of the small countries. In the United Nations, there is an association of small states. This was started by, one of the initiators was Chu Tai-su, who was our representative at the United Nations. It would be good if India can give its support to us. So, I don't want to go into a long speech after this, but I wanted to register these 2 points that I have. One, the brilliance of the author and why we constantly depend on him to come and lead discussions here. The very first time I remember ISAS invited him, I didn't know him that well. Mr. Bilahari Kausikan chaired that session, and it was a very successful. Subsequently, we have always been keeping in touch with him, and we hope to continue to do that. Second is the shifting policy of the changes, changes in the Indian policy, which makes it an important player. Its size and its economy, that goes without saying. But as a player, there was little. Finally, may I once again thank our guest of honor for being here. We are very grateful to you. I'm grateful to Dr. Rani Mullen for chairing the panel and the panelists for participating, Dr. Iftekhar Chowdhury, Dr. Mukherjee, and of course, Mr. Shyam. I think it is very, very good. I also want to thank, because we have been having at the rate of 2 or 3 events per week, and this has been done in a very efficient manner. And I must thank my team in ISAS who delivered this. Mr. Harek Singh is ably assisted by Sitara and Jordan. This is the core team that actually is responsible for this. I want to thank them for doing this. And I am told by Harek for the next 12 to 13 days, we won't have an item. That's a great relief, at least for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Pillai. We'd like to now take the opportunity to introduce the book, which will put into context the discussions during the panel session. To do the introduction of the book, it is my pleasure to invite the author, Ambassador Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary of India. Ambassador, please.
Your Excellency Dr. Mohamad Maliki bin Osman, Senior Minister of State in the Ministries of Foreign Affairs and Defence of Singapore. My respected colleague, Dr. Gopinath Pillai, who has very kindly hosted this launch ceremony. The High Commissioners of Bangladesh and Pakistan. My friend and colleague from India, High Commissioner Javed, who is a very long-standing friend and colleague. The distinguished panelists who will be having a conversation later this morning with me, Dr. Rani Mullen, Dr. Iftekhar Chowdhury, and Dr. Mukherjee, and all distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me express my deep gratitude to Excellency Minister for doing me this honor of being present this morning at this launch. I really appreciate the trouble that he has taken to be here. And also, of course, Ambassador Gopinath Pillai and the Institute for South Asian Studies for arranging this launch this morning. It has been a great privilege for me to have been associated with the Institute of South Asia Studies, but in particular, Dr. Gopinath Pillai, with whom now I have developed a very close and friendly relationship, but also a relationship of great trust and also respect. He has been a great friend of India, continues to be a great friend of India. What I would like to assure him is that certainly with respect to Singapore, there is no big power complex that India can possibly have. because Singapore is such a critical partner for India. I cannot conceive of India's Act East policy without the very, very broad and multifaceted relationship that we have with Singapore. I think for not only the Indian state, but for Indian businesses, Singapore is the preferred platform to really do business with this region. And I think India acknowledges the importance of Singapore in that respect. And also, historically, in the recent past, if we look at the entire process of India starting as a sectoral partner of, sectoral dialogue partner of ASEAN, after we announced the Look East policy, to becoming a full dialogue partner, to also becoming a summit partner, our entry into the ARF and all the other fora that are associated with ASEAN. Almost on every occasion, it is Singapore which has played a very, very important role in easing India's entry into these fora. So we attach a great deal of importance to our relationship with Singapore. Of course, we will be having a discussion about the contents of the book later on. But I mentioned to Excellency Minister that originally my idea had been to basically put together, some of my writings on foreign policy, on security issues, as well as some of the, speeches that I have given on different subjects, into some kind of a collection, and publish that. That would have been, it seems, somewhat easier. But when I started that exercise, I found that it was the outcome was not something that I was happy with, because it did not have a kind of a coherence or a kind of a flow, or suggesting some kind of a broad theme in terms of India's engagement with the rest of the world. And that is how I gave up that idea and then started looking at whether I could put together a book. And so that's the result. It is, as you know, called How India Sees the World, because I think one of the reasons why I felt writing this book was important, because there has been a kind of a, academic discourse that India really does not have a strategy. India lacks any kind of worldview. That India's engagement with the world is very ad hoc. It does not have any kind of an overall theme within which it actually pursues its foreign policy. And I certainly felt that this was not true at all. That even though perhaps India may not have explicitly come out with a doctrine or come out with a strategy, even in one's own experience, I was certainly very conscious of the fact all the time that there was, in fact, a prism through which we were looking at the world. And this prism was not only what the current state of the world was, but it also derived very much from a long, period of India's engagement with the world. I have called India a crossroads civilization. Reason I have called it a crossroads civilization is that throughout history, India has been really the intersecting point of maritime routes, influenced by the monsoons, going east to Southeast Asia, to China, to Japan, going west to the Gulf, to even the eastern coast of Africa. So those maritime routes and the sort of connections which India built up, what we today call connectivity, but actually it's that ancient connectivity in a very real sense influenced India's engagement with the world. And similarly, the caravan routes going into Central Asia over millennia. So India in that sense has always been a kind of a global country, a globalized country. And one of the features I feel which is a strength of India is actually a very cosmopolitan temperament of its people. And this is the reason why I say in the book that if the world of the future is going to be even more globalized than it is today, where we'll be stepping on each other's toes all the more, where the aspect of the world having become a small neighborhood is actually become a reality, then it is those countries which are comfortable with diversity, comfortable with plurality, comfortable dealing with other cultures and civilizations, those are the countries which will probably be the more successful societies of the future. That's how I certainly see, how India will engage with the rest of the world. There are certain key elements that I spell out in the book. One is that I very strongly believe that there is no way that India can really play any kind of a meaningful regional role as a nation power or a global role, because it is a major economy, a major country. It cannot really think in terms of playing an optimal regional role or a global role unless it is able to have a South Asia, a subcontinent which is essentially at peace. Unless it is able to manage its relationship with its own periphery, it will not be able to play that kind of role. So the one, I find a theme right since the time India became independent, an effort on the part of different political leaders in India to try and address this issue. How does India become not a threat to its neighbor? How can India become an opportunity for its neighbors? And I do believe that today, when India is growing at a very rapid rate, its economy is maturing, it can actually be a very major opportunity for its neighbors. So that's one aspect. The second aspect that I have drawn attention to is the fact that if we are looking at contemporary challenges, I have devoted a lot of material in the book to China for various reasons. One is that when I joined the Indian Foreign Service, the language that I was asked to learn was Mandarin. So I spent 2 years in Hong Kong learning Mandarin. Those days there was still Cultural Revolution taking place in China, so I could not go to Beijing. So I had to learn the language in Hong Kong. And then I spent about 3 years in China from 1974 to 77. Then I went back to China from 83 to 86. And witnessing, at least the initial stages of this tremendous transformation which was taking place in a country which has a civilization, a culture which is as layered, as ancient as India is. Two very different countries in one sense, but in some senses also rather similar. I also believe that if there is one country which will have perhaps the greatest impact on the region and India, it will be China. And therefore, very importantly for India to know more about China and to be able to engage China in constructive ways. There will be, of course, a complex relationship where there will be areas of contention. We have the border issue, we have issues with respect to China's policies in our neighborhood. But I also believe that there are very important convergences that we share with China and that we can build upon. So that's the second theme. The third theme that I have tried to focus attention on is that looking forward, many of us are very locked into the conflicts of the day. I mean, whether in South Asia, we have the India-Pakistan conflict, or the worries that India has about what's happening in the rest of its neighborhood, the worries that our neighbors have about India, and the apprehensions about whether India will become a dominating presence in the region. But I do believe that we are now in a world where, frankly, the kind of conflicts which occupy our attention today will soon start becoming rather irrelevant. And this notion has come to me, this aspect, or this thinking has come to me because of my experience as a chief negotiator on climate change. Because that forced me to understand something about what's happening with climate change, what is happening to our planet's ecology. And the sense that when we talk about, the world having become a small neighborhood, that is compellingly so if we are looking at things like climate change. Because here is a challenge which does not recognize national boundaries, does not recognize even regional boundaries. And unless we are able to deal with this major challenge to the very survival of humanity, I think we are all the preoccupations that we have today, those preoccupations will seem in the future to have been rather misplaced in a sense. So I do argue in the book that some of the challenges that we face, like climate change, issues of public health, the fact that a epidemic may break out in some remote corner of Africa and spread all over the world. These are kind of challenges which no country by itself is able to resolve. Necessarily they demand collaborative kind of responses and mostly global responses. So I do argue in the book that going forward, is this not something that a country like India, which has that cosmopolitanism, which has that experience of working together with very diverse peoples, diverse cultures, is this something not that India should be looking at? Particularly when it has a tradition of treating nature as a mother, as a source of nurture, rather than some kind of a dark force which has to be conquered and harnessed to human greed. Is this where we want to go? So there are areas where I feel India, because of its culture and history, can be in fact a leading country, but also in terms of its the capabilities that it has built up, whether it is in space or cyber, some of those new technologies, these are also areas where India can bring a major contribution to the table. So as I began my remarks, that it has been a great privilege for India to have a very strong partnership with Singapore. And I think Singapore is testimony to the fact that size is not everything. I think Singapore has demonstrated how it has leveraged whatever advantages that it has had into becoming a very highly respected country in the world. And let me end by saying that notwithstanding what Ambassador Pillai had said about India neglected Southeast Asia, let me remind him that in Bando, it was Sukarno and Nehru who actually tried to bring about this broad consensus for the newly emerging countries, and driven by in fact a vision that this was the moment for Asia to become, in fact, the center of the world again. The vision of an Asian resurgence, including China, which was the reason why he was so keen that Chow Pillai should. So at least India began in its early years with actually a very strong sense that there has to be an Asian, that Asia must reconnect, that all the ancient connections which existed between India and Asia must be revived again, and that Asia must once again take its place in the world. In a sense, that is what has happened. Perhaps we have taken a somewhat tortuous path to that, but this is what has happened. And I think much of that is really because of the emergence of both India and China in our century. So I see that in the future, this is where much of the action will be, this region. And I believe that India will play an important role, but I also believe that Singapore will play a very important role. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'd like to now invite our guest of honor, Dr. Mohamad Maliki bin Osman, Senior Minister of State for Foreign Affairs and Defence, to deliver his address. Dr. Maliki, please.
Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Chairman of the Institute of South Asian Studies, and Ambassador at Large, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Singapore, Ambassador Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary of India and author of the book that we are launching today, Professor Subrata Mitra, Director of ISAS, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, very good morning. I would like to thank Ambassador Pillai and ISAS for inviting me to deliver the keynote address at today's book launch on how India sees the world and the panel discussion on India's foreign policy imperatives in a changing world. First of all, my compliments to the Institute of South Asian Studies community for organizing such an important event to further insights and understanding of Indian foreign policy at a time of global change. In this time of geopolitical change, it is particularly important that India and Singapore build on their shared values and interests. The historical links between India and Singapore, and indeed Southeast Asia, are deep. The manifestations of our shared heritage are found throughout Singapore and the region. Moreover, our histories have always been linked by a common core of values. These include a commitment to a rules-based order, a firm belief in open sea lanes of communication, and an open and inclusive regional architecture, with ASEAN at the center. Under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, India's Look East policy has been refashioned into an Act East policy. This reflects India's renewed commitment to eastward integration, especially through promoting trade and connectivity and deepening engagement with ASEAN. ASEAN is today's India's fourth largest trading partner, while India is ASEAN's seventh largest trading partner. Investment flows between both countries, or both sides, have been growing steadily, as have business linkages. India also plays an important role in promoting security in the Asia-Pacific. For example, India has concluded wide shipping agreements with many countries in the region and has emerged as a first responder and leader in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief cases from Yemen to Fiji. India's collaborative engagement in Asia-Pacific has been and will continue to be essential to the region's stability and prosperity. Let me talk about India and Singapore relations. First, on a strategic partnership. Singapore is well placed to play a role in India's Act East policy, given its geo-strategic location at the heart of ASEAN and its excellent relations with India and the ASEAN member states. India and Singapore have a strategic partnership built on deep bilateral economic, defense, and cultural ties. One of the key aspects of India-Singapore relations is our close defense cooperation. In November last year, India and Singapore signed a bilateral agreement on naval cooperation, which completed the triad of service-to-service agreements between Singapore and India, meaning that completes both the air, land, and sea agreements between the two armed forces. Defense cooperation allows for countries to contribute towards our common goal of maintaining peace and security in our immediate and broader region. Looking forward, there is much scope for even greater interactions between India and Singapore in existing areas of cooperation, as well as new ones such as innovation and fintech. There is also scope for Singapore to play a role in catalyzing greater engagement between India and ASEAN. As ASEAN Chair this year, Singapore is committed to deepening ASEAN's relations with its key partners, including India. As a civil, aviation, trading, and financial hub, we are a good base for Indian companies to work from in order to expand to Southeast Asia and beyond. Also, Singapore can play a role to connect the many companies from a wide range of countries who have found Singapore to be a useful operational base. We look forward to the visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to Singapore later this year to deliver the keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue. This will be the first time the Shangri-La Dialogue will be addressed by an Indian Prime Minister, and PM Modi's keynote speech is most timely and will be highly anticipated. The visit will also provide a good opportunity for both sides to discuss ways to further expand cooperation bilaterally and in the region. Let me conclude, ladies and gentlemen, by saying that India's foreign policy has always been an exercise of pragmatic discernment, both shaping and shaped by the ever-shifting sense of world politics. Ambassador Saran's book meticulously describes India's deft foreign policy imperatives in its rise as an economic and political powerhouse, not only in South Asia, but also in the Asia-Pacific region and indeed in the world. At this critical juncture, in multilateral engagement, where uncertainty abounds, this book serves as a timely marker of the critical nature of Indian foreign policy from a regional and global perspective. It is appropriate that the book is launched in Singapore, given the role that Singapore plays in India's larger engagement in the region. I congratulate the Institute of South Asian Studies and Ambassador Saran on the launch of this book. I'm sure that the panel discussion that follows the launch will provide further insights and discussions on India's foreign policy priorities in a changing world order. I wish you a very fruitful and engaging session, and congratulations again to the Ambassador for the launch of this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maliki. We'll now have the official launch of the book titled How India Sees the World. I would like to also invite Ambassador Saran, ISAS Chairman Ambassador Pillai, and ISAS Director Professor Subrata Mitra on stage. Can you please unmute? Yes, Ambassador Saran will present a copy of the book to Dr. Maliki. And now for a group photo. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now proceed for a short tea break at the foyer outside the ballroom. Please be back by 10:55 a.m. for the panel discussion. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I would like to introduce the distinguished panelists for the panel discussion. Dr. Iftekhar Chowdhury, Principal Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, and former Foreign Minister of Bangladesh. Dr. Rohan Mukherjee, Assistant Professor of Political Science, Yale NUS, Singapore. And Ambassador Shyam, former Foreign Secretary of India. The chairperson for the session is Dr. Rani D Mullen, Visiting Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. I now hand the floor to Dr. Mullen.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Dear Ambassador Pillai, Ambassador Saran, Professor Mitra, staff of ISAS who organized this wonderful event, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second half of today's event to launch Ambassador Shyam Saran's tour de force book on how India sees the world, and to discuss India's foreign policy imperatives in a changing world. Those of you who've had the honor of meeting Ambassador Saran and have had a chance to read his book will not have been surprised that Ambassador Saran has come out with a book that highlights his nuanced understanding, insider understanding of the workings of Indian foreign policy in such accessible and yet insightful prose. With a lens that views the Indian subcontinent as a single geopolitical and ecological space, he analyzes the neighborhood from scrutinizing what he sees as the intractability of the Indo-Pakistan relationship to giving pointers on how to chip away at the power asymmetry between India and China. He's also not afraid to highlight the deficiencies in the delivery of Indian foreign policy. Talking about India's relationship with Nepal, he writes that India's foreign policy engagement tends to be episodic and crisis-driven and not backed by the human and material resources that our neighbors deserve. All of this is delivered peppered with insights into India's sophisticated tradition of statecraft and diplomacy, harking back to Kautilya's Arthashastra, and based on Ambassador Saran's own insights as a shaper of Indian foreign policy. Particularly important for our panel discussions today are his insights into the post-2007 emerging multipolar world. It is in Asia that the new world order is likely to be shaped, Ambassador Saran argues. Given the immediacy of the topic and geography, his book raises a number of questions about India's foreign policy imperatives in a changing world, including how can Indian policy manage both realist Kautilian principles at the same time as rejecting intolerance within its borders and outside? How can Indian foreign policy best work to restore South Asian cohesion and make divisive borders irrelevant? How can India best harness its historically cosmopolitan outlook to foster a region and indeed a world where engagement and partnerships, not hegemony, are the power to influence? Our panelists, Dr. Chowdhury from ISAS, Professor Rohan Mukherjee from Yale and US, and of course Ambassador Saran will now discuss India's foreign policy imperatives in a changing world for about the next 45 minutes. Each panelist has 15 minutes to discuss their thoughts on this topic. And in order to ensure that we have about a half an hour for Q&As at the end, I would request that each panelist please stick to their 15 minutes. Dr. Chowdhury, yes, it's I'm half German, so it's the German side of me who will be the timekeeper. Dr. Chowdhury will start the panel. Thank you to all of you for coming here, and please help me welcome our panelists.
Many thanks, Chair. Chairman Gopinath Pillai, High Commissioners, Professor Subrata Mukherjee, Mithra. He's a Brahmin in my mind. I mean, what can I do? Ladies and gentlemen, in the days of yore, the received wisdom in the sphere of diplomacy was that speech was given to the diplomat to conceal his thoughts. This no longer holds good. Diplomats like to share their musings now. Not necessarily when they are in office, rightly so, for there are structural impediments to that. But many like to do it as soon as they can afterwards. I believe this culture to be stupendously positive, not just to scholarship, though also that, but also towards raising the quality of political policy making. This is in addition to a modicum of satisfaction to that the diplomat derives from introspective self-analysis of a life led in such a low-risk profession. This is an addition, that would be in consonance with the Socratic perception that an unexamined life is not worth living. I should know, having been a diplomat myself in my previous avatar, which is why every piece that I pen draws heavily from the life I led in the past. Tales from the Champagne trade often crisscross with paths littered with painful thorns, what every diplomatic life is born to be. Foreign Secretary Saran does it with incredible finesse. How India sees the world is a reflection of his prodigious intellect. The tome is sprinkled with an array of vivid facts. That in itself might not be surprising because as the principal Mandarin in India's Foreign Office, he was necessarily privy to those. But it is the mastery with which he weaves them into a set of extrapolations and conclusions that the reader and the world sees how India has acted, and more importantly, why. I was able to access a copy only a short time ago, and the two words in which I can describe it is, in quotes, most impressive. But the task I'm assigned today is not to talk on how India sees the world, but on how the world sees India, and particularly the rest of South Asia. In order to comprehend the perception in a satisfactory manner, it may be in order to frame a broad theoretical framework. This would be necessary in order to delineate the continuity or permanence in the behavior pattern without considering changes of government of different states, which is important but not necessarily overwhelmingly so. India, of course, both geographically and figuratively holds a central position in South Asia. It is the only country which has direct land borders with all the continental regional states, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal. Only a strip of sea separates it from the two other nations, Sri Lanka and Maldives. India is the regional preeminent power, politically, economically, and militarily. Some Indian analysts eschew the term predominant because it tends to imply a form of hegemonism which Indians like, rightly so, to shun. Yet India is in a position to exercise power, which the philosopher Armand Aron has defined in international relations as, and I quote, the capacity of a political unit to impose its will on other units, unquote. For all South Asian states, India has been the elephant in the room. Now, beside the elephant too, hovering just beyond the rim of the South Asian saucer is the dragon, that is China. China, with its burgeoning assertiveness, has a vision that is Zhongguomang, or the China Dream. It has a strategy that is the Road Belt Initiative, a massive tool of influence. It has resources, its huge reserve surplus. All these it is prepared to press into the service of peddling its interests, pitted sometimes in competition with China, with India. It too has the capacity to exercise power. But like India, it too needs to know the wise observation of the theorist who is known as the father of Anglo-Saxon School of International Relations, my academic mentor, Hedley Bull. Bull had written with considerable astuteness that the deepest fears of the smaller units in a global system is the larger neighbor. For smaller neighbors, now let us briefly examine how India's neighbors are reacting to Mr. Shyam Saran's invitation to see India as an opportunity and not a threat. For smaller neighbors in any part of the world, there can be at least 3 discernible ways of behaving vis-a-vis the larger and the more powerful. One is what Erwin Björk, a Scandinavian political scientist, described as pirate fish behavior, that is keeping close to the shark in order not to be eaten, or of the larger fish. Early Finnish post-World War II relations with the Soviet Union during the era of President Urho Kekkonen were an example. Somewhat comparable examples of India's neighbors in this regard would be Bhutan, though the Doklam crisis did reflect a pressure of Chinese proximity, and the Maldives through the Indian intervention during the Operation Cactus in '88, but now also rendered complex by China's presence as current developments demonstrate. A second option is what is adopted by Pakistan. It is to make up the power gap with the neighbor, a potential rival, by enmeshing itself in a web of extra-regional linkages. Pakistan did it during the Cold War by links with Western alliances like CENTO and SEATO, and later by the strategic all-weather partnership with China. Do we see a reflection here of the Kautilyan theory of the mandalas? The only other nuclear power in South Asia, Pakistan has built up a full-range spectrum of nuclear deterrence, shifting from the earlier minimal credible deterrence, disavowing the no first use principle. The doctrine implies deployment of low-yield ordnance, otherwise known as tactical weapons, nuclear weapons, which, in terms of strategic theory, risks lowering the nuclear threshold. Despite Mr. Narendra Modi's initial initiatives and reciprocity by Mr. Nawaz Sharif, bilateral relations, for a variety of reasons, became strained and snuffed out, at least for now, whatever modest forward movement the Association for Regional Cooperation, SARC, had achieved to date. The third behavior pattern of behavior by India's neighbors is the aspiration to live in concord with, but distinct from, the powerful neighbor. This is pursued by Sri Lanka, or generally pursued by Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bangladesh, with Bangladesh having some unique characteristics. The concord is obligatory given the magnitude of India's proximity and size. Nepal and Bangladesh are virtually India-locked, and the distinction is necessary to underscore the sovereign existence of these smaller countries. There is a countervailing presence all the time of China in all three, but also a desire in them to navigate, in them meaning the countries, to navigate carefully between the elephant and the dragon without giving umbrage to either. This requires an element of dexterity, which is really the challenge vis-a-vis the three countries, which the leaderships and population need to pick up as conflict. I've spoken of the unique characteristics that marks India-Bangladesh relations. Bangladeshis remain beholden to India for the support accorded during Bangladesh nascence in 1971. As a young civil servant, I was thereafter the private secretary to the Commander-in-Chief of our Liberation Forces, General M.A.G. Osman. The vicissitudes of fortune that marked the relationship for years between the two countries. Today, we've signed the land boundary agreement, though the water distribution is still hanging fire. Sometimes, for India's neighbors, India is a complex plural system where Delhi is but one focal point and one has to deal with others. For Bangladesh, Kolkata, for instance. For its smaller neighbors, Delhi oftentimes, therefore, is Hanuz Duras, is, as they say in Persian, still very far away. By 2007 to 9, I was privileged to serve as Bangladesh's foreign minister, nearly 4 decades after our independence. We in government then were persuaded that cordiality in interactions would be down to mutual benefit. At a lunch for Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, I summed up what I thought was the essence of our relationship. And I said, I quote myself, let us coexist and cooperate among ourselves. Let us optimize our potentials. Let us assist one another to progress and prosper. India among us is most blessed in terms of size, population, and resources. A spatial responsibility therefore devolves on her. We are confident that she will not shy away from it. As India grows, we would like to grow with her. Unquote. In the epic Mahabharata, Krishna debates with Arjuna, urging him to fight because the cause is just. Arjuna differs, reflecting on the possible resultant of misery and slaughter. Today, in confronting global problems of war, terrorism, poverty, and balancing between India's concerns with development and peace, India must take on board Arjuna's consequential analysis, in addition to considering Krishna's arguments for doing one's duty. I believe it is this philosophical capacity of the Indian ethos to be able to weigh in the considerations on both sides from which India's policies in the neighborhood must derive its intellectual nourishment. India must be the elder, not just the big brother. It must not only be the largest country in South Asia, but the country with the largest heart. It is as simple and as difficult as that. As a footnote, revival of SAARC must remain a goal. Sadly, we continue to run the risk of regional conflict through miscalculations in what is known as the Thucydides syndrome. The Greek historian had famously observed, when Athens grew strong, there was great fear in Sparta. At ISAS, we are making a modest contribution towards regeneration of the regional organization by encouraging our thought leaders to try and convert it into people's SAARC. Not an easy goal, but has it not been aptly said that man's reach should exceed his grasp? What else are the heavens for? I thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very grateful to ISAS for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's a real honor to be speaking on a panel to celebrate the launch of Ambassador Saran's new book. It was only a few years ago that, as a graduate student, I approached him to contribute to an edited volume I was working on India-Japan relations, and he very graciously agreed to do so to the great benefit of the final product. So it's really special for me to be able to share the stage with him and talk about his project, which is this excellent book in front of us called How India Sees the World. So as I was reading the book, I was reminded of something the well-traveled 19th century scholar Alexis de Tocqueville said. Speaking of politicians and diplomats and public officials, he said, "I have come across men of letters who have written history without taking part in public affairs, and politicians who have concerned themselves with producing events without thinking of describing them. I have observed that the first are always inclined to find general causes, whereas the latter, living in the midst of disconnected moving facts, are prone to imagine that everything is attributable to particular incidents, and the wires which they pull are the same that move the world. Both should be considered mistaken." Unquote. Ambassador Saran's book takes this observation to heart, striking a remarkable balance between analysis and anecdote, and in the process producing something that is at once ambitious and subtle. It begins with a wide-ranging intellectual history of India's view of the world, from the ancient texts, including the Arthashastra, down to the British diplomat Ernest Sato's book, A Guide to Diplomatic Practice, which he himself read, Ambassador Saran read as a young probationer in the Indian Foreign Service in 1970. In this manner, he captures the sheer diversity of influences on India's worldview and at the same time emphasizes the continuities in this worldview. He firmly rejects the notion that there was no India before the British Raj, demonstrating the geographical and political continuity of India from a time well before when China was united by the Qin dynasty at the end of the Warring States period. It was also in this period under the Mauryan Empire that Kautilya wrote the Arthashastra and propagated the notion of the Raja Mandala, or circle of kings. And this was a way of looking at the world in concentric circles of friends and enemies radiating outward from India. It produced a specific pattern of statecraft and a set of precepts for Indian rulers to follow. And indeed, many scholars and practitioners, including Ambassador Saran himself, argue that the Mandala conception of the world remains alive in India's worldview today. And he walks his talk. He structures his book in similar fashion, starting with India's worldview and then radiating outward to discuss India's relations with Pakistan, China and Nepal, and finally moving to the wider world in which he covers India's relations with the United States and global governance more broadly. Along the way, he offers valuable insights into the sources of India's conduct on various issues and the impact of India's actions on its strategic environment. And these insights are occasionally accentuated by very apt personal stories and accounts of his encounters with these other cultures as India's representative. So that's as much as I want to say about the content of the book, since I'm sure he's already covered it and he will cover it again in his remarks. What I want to do for the rest of my time is to expand on some very interesting themes that caught my attention as I read the book. And in doing so, I want to highlight the ways in which this book compels us to think deeply about the core of India's identity as it faces the world, and to consider difficult questions about whether India has what it takes to achieve its aspirations to become a great power. The first theme is the notion of strategic autonomy. Very early on in the book, Ambassador Saran tells us strategic autonomy is the ability of a state to take relatively independent decisions on matters of vital interest. And he says it's a running and consistent theme in India's foreign policy since independence. Very importantly, he tells us that it's an objective or an aim of India's foreign policy rather than a means to some other end. In fact, India's Cold War foreign policy of non-alignment in this framing becomes a means of attaining strategic autonomy. Now, many foreign interlocutors of India, especially in the US, have criticized India's dogged adherence to this goal of strategic autonomy. They argue that it prevents India from taking a more assertive stance in foreign affairs, from forming alliances or meaningful partnerships with other countries, and from fighting on behalf of the good guys, as it were. And yet, it's plainly obvious that no country values its strategic autonomy more than the United States itself. In fact, no country that is a great power or that thinks of itself as a great power, be it the US, China, or Russia, will tolerate any infringement of its independence in international affairs. But these are also the countries that are sufficiently powerful to easily ward off any potential threats to their autonomy. Arguably, India is not there yet. And this raises the question of whether it's only the great powers that can afford to pursue strategic autonomy. Perhaps as a rising power, India might have to compromise on this goal somewhat until it attains great power status. So in terms of strategy, what then is the prudent objective for India? Strategic autonomy or not? Now this is something we're thinking about and I hope we can talk about further. Now it's possible that India is also an outlier when it comes to its strong desire for strategic autonomy, even as a relatively weak country in the 1950s. At this point, another theme emphasized by Ambassador Saran becomes important, which is culture, or strategic culture. In much of the political science discipline that is taught in the West at least, culture tends to be devalued as an explanation for why countries behave the way they do. And yet any diplomat worth his or her salt will tell you that culture is vital to understanding how states behave. We wouldn't all be here to celebrate a book about how India sees the world if culture was irrelevant, and there was no difference between how India or any other country saw the world. So if we take culture seriously, then it's possible to view India's quest for autonomy as a cultural trait, just as China's quest for centrality as a middle kingdom may be named in its culture. But at the national level, I've always struggled to pin down what exactly constitutes India's strategic culture, or the way in which India thinks about international affairs. I was once in the audience for a public lecture given by Ambassador Saran's successor as Foreign Secretary, Mr. Iftekhar Chowdhury, and during the Q&A session, I asked him to elaborate on what he meant by India's strategic culture, particularly what sets it apart from other countries. His answer was realism plus values. Back then, this seemed like a convenient answer to me, one that sort of plays it safe, covering both national interest and moral considerations. But the more I've thought about it since, and especially after reading Ambassador Saran's book, I've come to appreciate the nuance contained in this description. It's contained precisely in his description of the dual strands of India's worldview, one informed by Kautyaya's realpolitik and the other by Ashoka's ideal polity. One might also think of it in terms of pragmatism in the service of certain ideals. This is as good a description of Nehru's non-alignment or contemporary India's multi-alignment as one can find. Now, apart from the national level, culture is also extremely important in the day-to-day business of diplomacy. Understanding another country's culture through its language, customs, and habits, even its cuisine, can be a valuable part of a diplomat's toolkit. It's no surprise then that all the high-performing foreign ministries in the world require their diplomats to undergo intensive language training prior to foreign postings. And some of the best and most original insights on China in this book stem from Ambassador Saran's account of how he grappled with the difficult task of learning Mandarin as a foreign language in the 1980s. Understanding culture helps you understand, for example, that in some diplomatic contexts, an initial refusal of your request is not the final word, but an invitation to negotiate in good faith. Often India's diplomats are criticized by other countries for failing to grasp this basic principle, and instead viewing negotiations in purely zero-sum or win or lose terms. As they say, a good compromise leaves both sides dissatisfied. This is something Ambassador Saran has learned through his experiences, and many others who have followed in his footsteps have perhaps not yet internalized to the same extent. The book also subtly emphasizes the vital importance of intercultural understanding for India-China relations. This is a point that bears constant repeating. It's remarkable that of the 8.8 million foreign tourists who visited India in 2016, only 250,000 odd were Chinese, or from China rather, which is about 2.9%. India receives more tourists than that from Australia, which is much further away. Similarly, of the 31.5 million foreign tourists, excluding Hong Kong and Macau, who visited China in 2015, only roughly 730,000 or 2.3% were from India. These are really low numbers for a total combined population of 2.7 billion. More importantly, from a societal perspective, there is very little understanding in either India or China of each other's culture, worldview, and history. Aside from a handful of universities in India, very few institutions take the study of China seriously. If you remove the number of people studying and writing about China in the context of international security, the number is even lower. And the same is true on the Chinese side. It sounds trite, but often there is no substitute for people-to-people exchanges, even if it's just to appreciate differences. The problem is even more acute when you consider the worldviews of current generations entering the Indian Foreign Service. A few years ago, I happened to see the results of a survey of the incoming batch of ISAS officers conducted by a Delhi University professor at the Foreign Service Institute, where they all get trained in their first year. And when asked which languages they would like to learn the most of them mentioned European languages. Hardly anyone mentioned Chinese or Japanese, let alone Malay or Bahasa Indonesia. And this type of disconnect between India's strategic priorities and the aspirations of its future diplomats can be a cause of concern. Now, the state of the Indian Foreign Service is something that Ambassador Saran touches on in his book as well, but more from a personnel point of view. And this is an extremely valid perspective from which to consider the problem. According to the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, the IFS is composed of approximately 600 officers, although Ambassador Saran, your own estimate is about 900. Now, this does not include support staff or administrative personnel, but basically Indian foreign policy is conducted by 600 individuals spread out across 162 missions and posts and headquarters in Delhi. The corresponding number of foreign service officers in Singapore is around 650 officers across 47 posts and headquarters in Singapore. Now, depending on how you look at it, this is either a huge challenge for India or exactly as it should be. In other words, a foreign service cadre this small is appropriate if your ambition is to be a small but highly relevant presence on the global stage, like Singapore. But of course, India wants to be much, much more. So to be globally a leading power, as Prime Minister Narendra Modi wants India to be, India needs a diplomatic corps that is not stretched thin trying to manage the numerous demands on its time and energies. If we talk to diplomats in the capitals who deal with India, they will frequently express their deep admiration for the truly astounding talent of the IFS, while also bemoaning the institutional lack of attention given to issues relevant to their country's relations with India. So this naturally raises the question of how much longer India can continue on its current global trajectory with such an institutional shortcoming. But India's most difficult institutional challenges actually lie at home, and Ambassador Saran also points this out in his book. It is in the realm of domestic governance. And it's precisely this issue of state capacity that might end up being India's greatest weakness in the coming decades. India faces daunting challenges of urbanization, sustainable development, poverty reduction, and public services delivery, not to mention widespread competition and conflict between social and ethnic groups. It's these internal contradictions that India must address first and foremost if it is to become a great power in these uncertain times. The world today is changing rapidly around us, especially in the Asia-Pacific. In fact, the Asia-Pacific itself has now broadened to include India and is increasingly referred to as the Indo-Pacific. And yet Ambassador Saran's book is a timely reminder that despite all the churn and tumult we see around us, we are far from losing our cultural and philosophical moorings as societies and civilizations. There is a deep thread of continuity that runs throughout his book, from Kautilya to the 21st century. It is evident in the very notion of India he espouses in the opening chapter. It's also evident in the details, such as the idea of publicizing Pakistan's transgressions in Balochistan every time Pakistan brings up Kashmir. This was something that Prime Minister Modi did in 2016, and the Indian media celebrated it as something very new, very novel. But in fact, the idea had been around long before that, and originated with Ambassador Saran. Continuity is also evident on a much grander scale in the book, at the planetary level. Careful readers will notice an undercurrent of passionate commitment on the author's part to a more humane and sustainable way of living as individuals, societies, and species. This undercurrent, of course, it rises to the surface towards the end of the book when Ambassador Saran discusses India's role in international climate change negotiations. But in fact, it's present throughout, reminding us that no matter the great powers that rise and fall or the wars that are won and lost, the natural environment is an underlying variable that we can only continue to ignore at great peril. Ambassador Saran elevates this principle to a level of moral duty, and I think everyone, not just Indian readers, would do well to pay attention to this aspect of the book. So in conclusion, I extend my heartiest congratulations to you for this outstanding achievement. I think this book is both broad and deep in its scope. It surpasses many other works by astute observers of India and its worldview. And I hope that you haven't exhausted all your creative energies and that you might write more in the future along these lines. I think I'll just end there and let you take over. Thank you.
I don't know whether I have anything more to add. Thank you very much, Rani, for chairing this panel discussion. And I must also thank the fellow panelists, Dr. Iftekhar Chowdhury, as well as Rohan, for the very perceptive comments that they have made on the contents of the book. I think perhaps the best I can do is to maybe respond to a few issues that have been raised by my fellow panelists. One, Rohan mentioned the aspect of capacity, and that of course is something that I have drawn attention to in the book. Let me say that the numbers are not as low as you mentioned about the size of the Foreign Service. When I was Foreign Secretary at that time, the numbers were a little over 700. And it is with considerable effort that we were able to persuade the then government to double the size of the Foreign Service. And that finally was accepted, that in 10 years' time, the Indian Foreign Service would become 1,500. Now, I would acknowledge that even 1,500 for a country like India, which has ambitions, aspirations to expand its global engagement, as it is already doing, will be sufficient. Certainly not. But I think at least there is a start. And I think currently the numbers would be around 900 or perhaps more. I think Javed would perhaps, would that be that? Yeah. So the numbers are increasing. I would say that the Indian diplomats go through a rather rigorous training process. So the quality of younger diplomats is good. In terms of language skills, if I look at just those who are learning Chinese, the quality of their training is perhaps even better than some of us have had. There are Indian Foreign Service officers who routinely interpret for our head of state and government. So there has been a change. Not enough, but at least it's a start. The issue, the larger issue of governance is of course something which is very difficult to get away from because we are not only living in a very complex international environment, but India itself has become very complex, and there are so many moving parts. So the challenge of governance has become that much more difficult, and there are no easy way out from this. You have to address this. I think one of the things that perhaps we should be looking at is that today it is not only the central government which is important in terms of what happens inside India, but in fact state governments have become extremely important. Sometimes they are more important carriers of change than perhaps sometimes even the center is. And even in terms of foreign policy, as Ambassador Iftekhar Chowdhury has mentioned, that taking into account the perceptions of states which are bordering other countries, this becomes indispensable. Which is the case, for example, with the river waters, sharing of the river waters, which the central government is committed to, but has so far not been able to take, the Chief Minister of West Bengal along. Now, with regard to the neighborhood itself, of course, it is important for India not only to articulate how it sees its neighborhood, but how do neighbors see India? And I think I have tried to cover that aspect in the book. We have no doubt in our mind, at least at the policy making level, that it is inevitable that India, as the largest country in the subcontinent, will, no matter what it does, will generate apprehensions, fears of domination amongst the smaller neighbors that it is. This is something which we have to accept as a given. And how do you then construct diplomacy which is able to some extent, it will never be 100%, but how do you construct a diplomacy which conveys a sense of reassurance to the neighbors, but also importantly, can the very size of India, can the very size and dynamism of its economy become an asset in pursuing that kind of diplomacy? Which is the reason why I have said that the challenge really lies in, since we are in the region facing similar problems of poverty alleviation, of issues relating to health, issues relating today, as I mentioned, ecology. There is no way in which South Asia can deal with the challenge of climate change, melting glaciers or rising sea levels, or the destruction of biodiversity, unless the countries of the region work together. There is no way. So, is there some way in which the very size of India and the economic dynamism that it today displays, and the fact that it has adopted for the last couple of decades a very open and liberal economic policy, can that become a asset in terms of reordering the relationship between India and its neighbors? I mean, that essentially is what we need to do. So, what my own experience in having served in Nepal, and Javed has also been in Nepal, has been that we need to have a much higher level of engagement with each of our neighbors. lot of the time, since the capacity issues, there are many, for the political leadership in India, foreign policy is one aspect, but there are many other complex challenges inside the country. You do not have the same level of engagement with the neighbors as you must have if you wish to have a good relationship. And this was always an issue with Nepal. My Nepali friends used to sometimes say, all the time India is, trying to find ways in which it can control Nepal and control events in Nepal. And I would tell him that the challenge that I face as an ambassador to Nepal is how to get enough attention for Nepal. Not that 24/7 somebody is sitting in South Block conspiring against Nepal. The main challenge for us was that we just could not get at the central political level the kind of attention that a complex relationship like the India-Nepal relationship requires. And that is where we keep perhaps falling short. So this is why I have said that while rhetorically we have accepted that India must attach the highest priority to its relationship with its neighbors, but it has not yet got to the point where it actually has resources, human resources as well as material resources, mobilized to the extent that is necessary in order to achieve what our objectives in the region are. That is the reality. Mention has also been made about our relationship with China. I mentioned in my opening remarks that the one country which will have perhaps the most significant impact on India's international relations will be China. That is perhaps a self-evident fact. How we manage our relationship with China and equally how China manages its relationship with India will, I think, have a very, very major significant impact on the future of Asia itself. So it is a responsibility that India and China have, not only because of their bilateral relations, but because of what this means in that larger context of the future of Asia and the world. Now, here let me give you a sense of how perhaps things may have undergone some change. So in 2005, when I was Foreign Secretary, and we had a dialogue with China. At that time, even though there was an asymmetry between India and China, but at that time, India was seen as perhaps growing even at a faster pace than China. So even there was a gap, but India was coming up very fast. Perceptionally, the world was looking at India as perhaps becoming another China. That was the kind of general perception. And India, during that period, I think played its cards rather well as an emerging country, because it also enabled us to bring about a major change in our relationship with the United States of America. As someone who was very closely associated with the negotiation of the India-US nuclear deal, which I believe was a very, very important change in India's interests, that would not have been possible if there had not already been a perceptual change, as I mentioned, with respect to the emergence of India. It is that emergence which enabled us to use the upgradation of our relations with one major power to actually promote the upgradation of our relations with another major power. So, it was a very dynamic process. But China also sensed that it needs to have a different kind of relationship with India if its own strategic space, does not get constrained because of what the US might be trying to do or what Japan may be trying to do. So, in April 2005, when Premier Wen Xiaopao came to India, there were certain set of principles which the two sides agreed upon. One was that India and China are two very large continental-sized economies. They are ancient civilizations who have a certain sense of identity, a sense of themselves. No country can contain China. Similarly, no country can contain India. So, China is not interested in containing India, neither should India think that it can contain China. So, that was one very important aspect. Second aspect was that both India and China are emerging economies, major emerging economies. But that India was not a threat to China and China was not a threat to India. This should be understood. And thirdly, that India was an opportunity for China, economic opportunity particularly, as a very major emerging economy. And similarly, China was an opportunity, economic opportunity for India. So there were ways in which the two sides could work together. And the next point of consensus was that both India and China, as emerging economies, as major countries with a sense of themselves as major players in the international order, have a convergent interest in, number one, adjusting existing global regimes such as the WTO or, for example, various other regimes relating to maritime security or cyber security as an emerging area, or climate change as an emerging challenge. In all these, India and China had in fact convergent interests to try and adjust existing regimes in order to better reflect their aspirations, their concerns, as also to shape the future regimes that were beginning to become important, like climate change. And if you ask Indian negotiators in WTO or in climate change, who were perhaps their most important allies in those negotiations, it was the Chinese. I mean, that was my own experience as a climate change negotiator, that we worked very, very closely together with China. So these were some of the principles that were agreed upon, and that there is enough space in Asia and the world for both the emergence of India as well as China. And finally, that there could be no Asia, a resurgent Asia, without both an emergent India as well as China. Therefore, from this it followed that in order to do these big things that India and China need to do together, they need to get rid of the legacy issues such as the India-China boundary issue. And that is what led to the guiding principles and political parameters for resolving the border issue. This was the context. And in fact, over the next several years, India-China relations did develop in a rather positive manner. The change that has started coming about is really from about 2007-2008, the global financial and economic crisis, which brought about a major reordering in a sense, what people are now talking about tectonic shifts in the geopolitical landscape, where China began to start, instead of thinking of itself as another major emerging country, actually started benchmarking itself with the United States of America. It saw itself, with perhaps good reason, that it was in now a different league than other emerging countries like Brazil or South Africa or India, a group to which it was very proud to belong before. Now this is where I think some of the new sort of confrontation at times or contention at times have re-emerged, where I think China believes that one of the phrases which I always come across when talking to our Chinese friends is, even if there are issues, they say, but you must not forget that we are 5 times your size. As if this determines, or you should know your place, or others should know. It is like in 2010, I think Yang Jiechi saying in the ASEAN meeting that, you are just small countries and China is a big country, don't forget that. This is, I think, the issue that really has become, it's not just what is happening on the ground, but in terms of, what is the perception that China has of itself, and its place in the world. So for India, it has now become an issue of how do we deal with that challenge. I think it would be fair to say that the Indian approach continues to be that yes, we have to acknowledge that there are points of contention. We can't escape those. But also there are points of convergence. So rather than look at the relationship from a either or standpoint, to see what are the ways in which we can build upon those convergences which still exist, but equally to confront China if India's interests are in fact threatened in any way. So part of the reason why Doklam happened on the India-Bhutan-China border was precisely because of that. And you saw what a violent reaction from China we had initially, at least. And the violent reaction was precisely that sense. You know, you are perhaps acting beyond what your capabilities are. You must remember. So how we deal with this kind of a changing, not only power landscape, but also attitudinal landscape in the region is going to be a very major factor in the future. It is not going to be easy. Lastly, I would say that the aspect of continuity is something which was very apparent to me when I started writing this book, that despite the different articulations of India's foreign policy, what I have called the aspect of strategic autonomy has been actually a running theme. And if you look at Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy, many people have said this is a major departure from the past. I do not believe that it's a major departure from the past. He is responding to some of those continuing factors in India's foreign policy. Don't forget that with respect to, for example, the neighborhood, here was a Prime Minister who, right from the word go, in fact, by inviting all the heads of state and government from South Asian countries to his swearing-in ceremony, even with Pakistan, despite the fact of whatever may have been the rhetoric in the election campaign, but he lost no opportunity to reach out to his counterpart, Nawaz Sharif, despite the problems we continue to have at the LOC at the border, to the extent of even unannounced, landing up in Lahore for meeting with Prime Minister. And he took a very big gamble, because this was not something which was very popular within his own political constituency. So you see that every leader in India has recognized the logic of how India cannot play that bigger role unless, in a sense, it is able to at least manage the relationship with Pakistan. I'm not saying that establish necessarily in the immediate future friendly relations with Pakistan, but at least manage what is going to be what I call an adversarial relationship with Pakistan for the foreseeable future, but to use a more mix of negative or positive levers, as I call it, to at least keep the relationship on a more or less even keel. Only that can permit India to play a larger role that it aspires to. And every Prime Minister, of course, Dr. Manmohan Singh made a very, very major effort. And though people may have expected that Prime Minister Modi will follow a different kind of policy, but if you look at it in essence, the policy is driven by the same objective. I think if you see the Prime Minister's policy towards the United States, many people felt that, having been denied a visa by a previous US administration, he may not have the same kind of a positive attitude towards the United States as the previous government had. But again, from the word go, not only did he carry forward the policy of the previous government, but arguably he expanded it much beyond what many people had thought. And even on nuclear deal, which BJP opposed when the Congress was in government, who actually took care of wrapping up some of the loose ends that were still left? It was Prime Minister Modi. So I do believe that there is that continuity in India's foreign policy, which sometimes we may lose sight of, and those are driven by both historical, cultural and other factors, which change a little more slowly over a period of time. Lastly, I would say the aspect of, whether or not it's a realist policy or whether it is an ethical policy, frankly, I believe that this distinction is completely artificial. Any foreign policy, in order to be successful, has to have, at some point, it has to have some ethical goal. To think of foreign policy as something which is completely detached from the value system of the society that you represent, I do not think that is possible. So I would not make that very clear distinction. Previous governments were following a sort of more idealistic foreign policy, and that we are now following a realistic foreign policy. If you actually read Mr. Nehru's very extensive works on foreign policy, you will see that despite the fact he may have perhaps had a kind of a vision of India's foreign policy which seemed at times idealistic, but it was very much anchored in a very realistic assessment of what India's capabilities were and what its interests were. So I would not make that very clear distinction. And I would also say that my experience as a diplomat has brought me to understand one very important issue, which is that diplomacy, I always say, can only work in grey. If you pose issues in black and white, then the room for diplomacy shrinks. And I think as diplomats, we have a great, duty to make sure that that space for diplomacy does not shrink so much that it becomes, an adversary becomes black and white, or we start framing our national interests in very absolute terms. I think that is what will make for an unsuccessful foreign policy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much to all three of our panelists. I think we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. I would ask that if you have a question, if you just identify yourself so we know where you're from. And maybe we'll start with the lady in blue in the back.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for your views this morning. My question to Mr. Sharan is basically about China's Belt and Road Initiative. What do you make of India's decision to stay away? Do you think India's views will evolve at some point, and under what circumstances?
Yeah, so
Maybe we'll take two, because I saw a number of hands and we only have 20 minutes. Professor Mitra.
One of the aspects of your book which has not been much talked about is the transparent sincerity of the tone and the very specific individual insights you provide to the making of foreign policy at the level of individual embassies. They do not simply implement a global line. A lot of foreign policy is also made at the level of individual embassies, and that's something that comes across as it should from a book like yours. My question to you is, what happens if we reverse the question you are asking? You're asking how India sees the world. Suppose we ask how the world sees India. Now, the South Asian world, looking at India, would be a little confused, because Indian foreign policy has usually focused on negatives, non-alignment, not citing the NPT, not going to Beijing, not letting the SARC meeting take place in Islamabad, and currently not speaking to Pakistan. Now, these are negatives which are very difficult to interpret, because it doesn't signal what interest is being maximized. Because you assert in the book that there is a grand strategy behind Indian policy. If it is strategic, then this negative should signal what is being maximized. Now, thank you very much for this excellent explanations of India-China relations. But why did India not go to Beijing to join up in the celebration of the BRI? There is a putative Indian explanation that the BRI goes over territory illegally occupied by Pakistan. Or in other words, we are not going because we are putting pressure on China to put pressure on Pakistan to vacate those illegally occupied territories. Well, it didn't happen. No one expected it to happen. No one believed that that was the real reason why India was not going. The real reason is what you are saying, that an asymmetry has crept in to the old relationship of being fellow emerging countries. And India is indicating that an asymmetry is growing, and we will not go to mark that there is an asymmetry, and we have to think our own strategy through. If that is the case, then why is India not acting on the huge deficit that has grown in India-China trade, $55 billion, because the Chinese would not allow India's prime export commodities, pharma and services. The Chinese are not playing on a level playing field. India doesn't talk about that. India has not put pressure on China, nor has India refrained from borrowing heavily from the bank. So, if you are a small neighbor of India in South Asia, you would want to know exactly what is India after. Or in other words, how India sees the world is probably clearer than how the world sees India. This ontological gap between self and the other can only create confusion. I'd like you to comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so, I mean, there is a link in both these questions because of the Belt and Road Initiative and what India's attitude is. Number one, there is a difference between CPEC and the BRI as far as India is concerned. CPEC we will oppose for the simple reason that it goes through, as you said, territory which India claims as its own territory. For China to say that there is greater advantage to be had if you joined this because it will improve connectivity in the region and will promote prosperity. That is a rather specious argument because China opposes any kind of project being done by third countries in any territory that it claims, including, for example, territory it claims from India. So, the World Bank and Asian Development Bank are not able to do projects in Arunachal Pradesh because China says you cannot do these projects because it is Chinese territory. Even to the extent of saying that the central government in India should not do projects in Arunachal Pradesh. So to have this kind of a double standard that no, you should not raise this issue of territory or territorial sovereignty is, I think, not a valid argument. Secondly, even for argument's sake, if you say that it promotes connectivity, then the connectivity part can only be promoted if India actually gets transit through Pakistan. Only then can it take advantage of this. But when we have asked our Chinese friends, is this on offer? Is this something that giving connectivity to India through Pakistan, is it part and parcel of what you are proposing? To answer to that is not our business, that you have to deal with Pakistan. So if that is the case, then what benefit are we talking about? Okay. So that is with regard to CPEC. As far as the BRI is concerned, I always draw attention to the difference in India's attitude to the BRI and to, for example, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank or say the BRICS Development Bank. In both these cases, latter cases, India was very much part and parcel of all the consultations leading to the shaping of these institutions. What will be the structure of the banks, what will be the personnel policy, what would be the loan policy, what would be the evaluation policy, what would be India's role in these. So as you are perhaps aware, that for the BRICS Development Bank, it is an Indian banker who's heading the BRICS Development Bank. And in the AIIB, the number 2 man is Indian, because we are a second largest shareholder. So there has been no reservation on India's side in being an equal participant in these two institutions. What is the difference with the BRI? With the BRI, we have always tried to talk to our Chinese friends that this is a Chinese initiative. You have laid out what the BRI is. It will be financed essentially by Chinese banks lending to essentially Chinese state-owned enterprises, which are then either investing in or undertaking projects in third countries, in partner countries. So I have no role to play in terms of how this initiative is shaped. It is not a multilateral initiative. It is a string of bilateral partnerships between China and partner countries. Now, countries are free to be partners in this particular. We have no issue with that. But when it comes to India's participation, I think it is fair on our part to say that this ought to be the outcome of a consultative process between India and China. So, for example, if the BRI includes a port development in Indonesia, what will be the role of the two countries? How is it going to be financed? Is it viable or not? Who will determine whether it is viable or not? What will be the longer term sort of economic burden on the country which is becoming a partner? Has the interest of the country, the views of the country which is participating being taken into account or not? And that is important because you see what has happened, for example, with one of the projects in Sri Lanka, which is Hambantota. So, to the extent that even the interest payment on the loan, which has come from the Chinese Exim Bank at 6% rate of interest, even that interest payment, Sri Lanka has not been able to fulfill that obligation. So, on balance, we believe that if India has taken a more cautious stand on this, it has good reasons to do so. Having said that, if there are projects, particular projects, which are viable and which India certainly sees an interest in, say a port project in India or in some other place, it is not that India will say that, I will not participate in this project, merely because it has a BRI tag on it. Or for example, when the AIIB is giving loans, if some project has a BRI tag, we will not say that no, there should not be. The judgment will be on the basis of whether it is viable or not. So I think we should look at this in a somewhat larger perspective. And many people have said that India is missing the bus. By not becoming part of the BRI, it is missing the bus. I do not think so, because has, for example, large Chinese companies like Xiaomi, for example, or Alibaba or others, have they stopped investing in India because India has decided not to become part of BRI? No. The judgment on whether or not to invest in India is actually taken on the basis of, does India offer an attractive market or not? And for a lot of the Chinese mobile companies, India is the only large market which is growing. So they are not saying, oh, because you have not signed up to the BRI, we will not come and invest in India. You will come and invest if you think it is worthwhile. If you don't feel it is worthwhile, BRI or no BRI, you will not invest. Lastly, with regard to the trade imbalance between the two countries, of course it is a major issue between the two countries. And for you to think that we have not raised this issue is simply not correct. This is usually on the top of the agenda whenever we have a official level dialogue with China. So the fact that there is not a level playing field, the registration of, for example, the Indian pharmaceuticals. They make us go through a very, very cumbersome process, which you are never able to complete. Or even with regard to, say, information technology. Many of our companies which were very, very helpful to China in training some of their people in Bangalore, like Infosys or TCS, they are finding it very difficult to, China, having developed some of that capability itself, is now not willing to give you market space. So there are these kind of issues which, we have to deal with. I think, as I said, there are still areas where we believe that the two sides do have certain convergent interests. China certainly looks at India as perhaps the only large market, which is still growing very rapidly, and is willing to and wants to enter into certain areas. They develop projects, for example, one of the major ports in Kerala is being developed by a Chinese company. Several of the power projects which are being undertaken in India, the main contractors are Chinese. Even the credit for that is coming from China. So it is not as if, it's a bit of a glass half full, glass half empty kind of situation.
I think we'll just take a last round of questions, and then maybe we can, because we just have about a little bit less than about 7-8 minutes.
Okay. May I react to him? Okay. To a certain extent, I did speak to how the rest of South Asia looks at India, by the way. Another thing that you have to bear in mind, for us, the smaller countries, there is yet another challenge that India is not the only actor that we look and work with. As you have noticed yesterday in this half-day symposium on Bangladesh, you heard Rumana say that, for example, when we export our garment, it is to Europe. We get our $31 billion from European Union. When we are looking to procurements for weaponry, we are looking to China. When we are looking to home for our expatriate labor, we are looking to the Middle East. So the relevance of India, to a certain extent, in a multilateral global world, shrinks because we all are becoming globalized. So that is another factor. This is not to say that just because you are not immediately relevant, you are not useful. Of course you are. India is very large. India is a preponderant existence. But we have to relate to many other actors, and all of us have to relate to the United States of America. This is the price that we pay for our sovereignty. Were we part of a larger India, we would have perhaps behaved differently. But since fate, fortune or whatever has made us sovereign, we have a more complex matrix on which we operate globally. As to your point about embassies, which was, you made a point about embassies' contribution to foreign policy making. It's not just relevant to India, it's relevant to almost every country in the world. Twofold, of course. Sometimes, this is an important point, sometimes ministries do not necessarily trust embassies fully a lot because of the fact that they tend to believe that embassies develop as a kind of localitis. In other words, you develop a preference for the place in which you are posted than the allegiance that you owe to your headquarters. So ministries have to do this fine-tuning as to your sort of individual predilections of the embassy, of the ambassador, vis-a-vis central policy making. Surely every embassy makes inputs. I mean, we have ambassadors here. You all make inputs into foreign policy making. But it's not necessarily, I mean, in most countries today, embassies would not play a major role in foreign policy making.
All right, I think we'll take another round of questions. Over here, and then there's a question over there, and then one in the back.
China has got rid of most of its poverty, and therefore it is a rich nation. I think India has to concentrate on its own internal economy and rise equally and get rid of poverty. That makes the balances more equal. What is your opinion on that? Thank you.
Thank you. This question was my Ambassador Saran. Thank you for an excellent lecture. While we have been talking about China, I have a simple question. How does India see Japan, especially under the Modi administration?
Hi, name is Manu Sapnani. The question is on, India has been drawing closer to the United States for the last few years, I think, and how does that change the balance? I mean, in the sense that we see an alliance of US, Japan, Australia, India versus the other side, perhaps China and some others. So, and how does that put India in terms of the overall global position, strategic position?
Okay, so I've read your book. In your book, you have been very intellectually honest on your views and opinions. There's this part here where you spoke about the post-independence foreign policy of India. Elements such as the rejection of neo-colonialism or restricting FDI-led growth, the non-alignment movement of India. And this has actually, because of the colonial masters, India actually holds its political freedom very dear, because freedom to India is not simply a change of masters. So the thing here is that it is the foreign policy since the years of Jawaharlal Nehru that has actually enabled India to have the current stand that it has now. And what I would like to know from you is that, do you think that in the effort of India to actually contain China, because in the current world order that we live, there's a rivalry between the United States and China, as well as India and China. And if India wants to contain China, the joint interest between the US and India, it may actually lead to a view whereby India will be viewed as a client state of the United States, and this is something that India should actually be very concerned. India should be very concerned about this, because for a country that has actually maintained such an independent foreign policy for so many years, just to contain China, I think India should not lose its independence, because if you look at the Indian nation, it's actually meant to be against the West. We got rid of the Western colonial masters, and India should actually be dedicated to the rise of this continent. Okay, the next point that I want to make is that. Give me 1 minute. Okay. Sure, thanks.
Just to allow Ambassador Saran enough time to answer.
Yeah, I know there are several points have been made. I'm afraid I don't think I can offer comments on each and every one of them. Dr. Vita also raised a number of points. I could not respond to all of them. Let me first of all say that to think that India's foreign policy after it became independent was an anti-West foreign policy, that's simply not true. I think India, in fact, through most of its early post-independence period, very actively sought closer relations with both countries in the socialist bloc as well as countries in the West, including the United States of America. I think part of the reason why relations with, say, the United States and the West did not go in as positive a direction as we may have wished is because of choices which the United States of America and the West made for their own good reasons, which did not necessarily conform to how India saw its own interests. So, to sort of think that this was anti-West and we should remain anti-West, I don't think that is a correct portrayal of what India's policy was. Non-alignment was not seen as an anti-Western. Non-alignment was that we will not let our interests be determined either by the West or by the East. And I'll give you an example how this works. So even though we had a very strong partnership with the Soviet Union from 1960 to 1990, many people would say that this was like a India-Soviet alliance. In fact, many people in the United States would say that India is on the other side of the fence. But for India, if you take, say, an issue like, say, non-proliferation, signing the non-proliferation treaty in 1968, despite the fact that both the US and Soviet Union put such a huge amount of pressure on India that it should sign the treaty, India did not, because of its own sense of, it's what its interests were. So there are partnerships which are possible, but where India draws the line is that alliance will not be something that India will go into. Why will India not go into an alliance? Because alliance means that I subordinate my interest to that of the leader of the alliance. So even if I look at my interests differently, as long as the leader of the alliance feels that this is something which is not in the alliance's interest, you cannot pursue your own interests. So this is what brings me to the what is now being called a Quad, that India is working together with Japan and the United States and Australia to construct some kind of a containment ring around China. Well, US, Japan and Australia are military allies. They are part of the alliance. India is not a part of a US-led alliance and will not be. So for there to be a perception that India is somehow or the other becoming a subordinate ally of the United States, that's simply not true. India cannot go in that direction. And as I said, with regard to China itself, for India to think that it can contain China, or for China to think that it can contain India, is simply not realistic, because of the fact that these are two continental-sized, economies, countries with very long history, civilizational sense of themselves. You cannot, in fact, think in terms of containing them. And frankly, the Cold War type of containment is no longer possible. The US was able to contain the Soviet Union because there was hardly any economic or trade relations with the Soviet Union. So there was no economic price to be paid through that containment. Today, the bilateral trade relations between China and the United States is more than $550 or $600 million. With that kind of trade interdependency, how can you try and contain China? Or even the other way around, how can China try to contain the United States of America? So we are living in a very different kind of a world in which interdependency is actually the reality, and there are limits, therefore, to the older notions of containment or trying to form blocks of where what you have today is, instead of alliances, what you have is coalitions of interests. Countries come together because they have a coalition of interests. We will not accept that we cannot talk to, say, Japan or the US or Australia on matters which are of mutual interest. But we are also part of, say, a Russia, China, India trilateral. Why? Because we believe that there are certain common interests which these three countries have, and it is useful for each one of them to actually engage in a regular consultation with each other. Or India has become a part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, in which China and Russia are leading countries. Why? Because we do not see our interests being confined only to a narrow set of relations with this country or that country. We are living in a much more complicated world. All of us say that we are living in a much more complex world. Now that, in dealing with this complex world, to think that we can somehow or the other order our relationship in terms of alliances, I think it is simply not realistic. So even if India wanted to become an ally of the United States, I don't think that would be something which would promote either India's interests or I would think even for the interests of the United States. Lastly, one of the most, I think, significant developments which have taken place in the last few years, certainly in my experience, is how India-Japan relations have developed. I have served in Japan. I was there from 86 to 89. I was in the embassy there. Very thin relationship, very cordial relationships, very friendly relationship, but very little substance in that relationship. Now it is in the last 10 years or so that the relationship has dramatically improved. Again, not only because of the personal relationship between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. This process started again much earlier, from about 2004, 2005. India and Japan started coming closer together. Part of it was, India's look east and act east policy. Our own horizons, widened somewhat. Japan's also horizons widened also in that same period. Also because of the changes in India's economic policy, economic reforms, liberalization, Japan started seeing India as also an economic opportunity. In terms of India's own development trajectory, Japan has become a very important source of both capital as well as technology. So many people think that it is because we want to contain China by coming together with Japan. I would say that there are many independent reasons why India and Japan should actually be working closely together. It's not necessary that we should only look at the China factor. Lastly, with regard to the aspect of poverty, of course, as I have tried to say, that one of the constraints that India feels at this point of time is that asymmetry, growing asymmetry between China and India, and the fact that China continually reminds you that there is that asymmetry by saying we are 5 times your size. We have tried to argue with our Chinese friends that there was also a time when you were maybe 1/5 or maybe 1/10 of the size of the United States, yet they did not prevent you from following an independent policy with respect to the US. Why should you feel that India should be different in following its policy with respect to China? Merely because we are not yet, the same size as China. So I don't think that relations between countries should be reduced to merely, what the GDP factor is. But it is true that unless India begins to once again develop at a much more rapid rate, and that rapid rate is necessary in order to, in fact, deal with poverty. How has China done that? By growing very fast, by creating many more employment opportunities. I think India is not quite getting to the point where it can actually, begin to address these issues at a pace that it would like. It's not that poverty has not declined in India. Of course it has declined. But it has not declined to the point where it can actually, look at other, or have the bandwidth in the governing structure to really look at many other important issues. So development challenge will remain the defining challenge for India for a considerable period of time. That's just the reality. The only difference is that, unlike in the past where you could say, let's forget about foreign engagements and entanglement and only focus attention on domestic economic development. Other things will come naturally once your economy develops. Today, it is not possible to think in terms of domestic development without also having at least a benign and supportive international environment. And even China's development is testimony to that. It was able to maintain that very high rate of growth because of a very favorable, supportive international economic environment. Its access to the American markets, its access to the Japanese market. So that external economic environment is today almost as important as what is domestically happening. So we cannot abstract from a very active foreign policy, even if you are looking at development as your main objective.
Thank you so much to both Ambassador Shyam Saran and Ambassador Chowdhury. Also, our panelists unfortunately had to leave, and we're just a couple minutes over our allotted time. So thank you all for your questions, for a really interesting discussion we've had here this morning. I think we're going to have some closing words.
Thank you, Dr. Mullen and distinguished speakers. With that, we have come to the end of this ISAS book launch and panel discussion. We thank you for your participation and we hope to see you at the next ISAS event. We have arranged for lunch reception outside this room. Enjoy the reception and have a nice day. Thank you.